for me. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this. I'm going to do a response video to Veritas48's video with 5 questions for atheists. I'm going to do this with notes that I took, but mostly off the cuff. So if it gets to be a little bit choppy, I apologize for that. But here we go.
And, if any of these questions seem loaded, it's not on purpose. It's just an inevitable fact that some of my theistic presuppositions may find themselves in how I phrase a particular question. So if that offends you, bless your heart, I'm sorry.
And it's very honest of you to admit that, and I appreciate that. We're all going to be subject a little bit to our presuppositions in life. That's always going to be the case, and so there's a little bit of begging the question in almost any answer anybody ever gives. But thank you for your honesty.
So the first question, it's pretty basic, and I'm sure it's one that you've all been asked before in some form or fashion. However, when I ask it, I'm not trying to set it up as a sort of gotcha question. Okay. The question is, if when you die, right, you find yourself in a place of judgment in front of God, and it ends up being the case that all those pesky Christians were right all along, what would your first statement be to God? If you could choose anything to say to God at that point, what would it be and why?
There are 3 ways to take this question. First way is to take it as a sort of veiled Pascal's wager, where you're saying basically, what if the Christians are right? But I'm going to take you at your word that you're really just asking the questions because you want to know the answers to how we would answer them, so I'm going to let that be my assumption going into that. The second way to take it is that it would mean that the Bible was a little bit misleading about the way God is, because according to the Bible, I'm not going to get the chance to ask God anything. I don't believe in God. When I die, I won't believe in God. I'm not going to become a foxhole atheist and suddenly accept the idea that there's a God. So when I do die, if I find out that the Christians were right, it's not going to be the case that God's going to give me a chance to explain myself. The third way to take this is with a sort of a twisted version that the Bible has hidden truths in it, and that God actually isn't the way that he's portrayed in the Bible, and the Christian overall view that God's loving and forgiving and wants us all to come and know him is true, and that there actually isn't going to be a hell per se. So we'll go with that assumption of what the question means, and if that's the case, then I would defer to Edward Current's response, which I'm going to link to here, and you can check that out. It's very similar to Bertrand Russell's quote that you gave. If I do actually end up having the opportunity to say what I want to say, basically what I would say is, okay, look, I failed your test, but the test was bullshit, so don't expect me to repent now.
The second question is, again, something that you've all probably been asked quite a bit, but I want to have my shot at asking it too, okay? What sort of evidence would you find sufficient for you to abandon atheism and become a believer in God? Not particularly Christianity per se, but just God, like a general sort of theism.
It wouldn't be the same evidence as a believer would accept, I can tell you that. Scientific evidence also wouldn't prove that it's God, because all scientific evidence would prove is that there is some being which is testable by science who exists and perhaps caused everything to happen, but that's not God, because God would be supernatural, and the supernatural can't ever be tested by science, so science couldn't prove it to me. The only thing that would ever prove to me that there is a God, I suppose, would be personal revelation. In other words, God would have to come to me and make himself known to me through some sort of personal revelation, but I wouldn't expect that evidence to be sufficient for anybody that I would then go to tell the evidence to. For example, if God did reveal himself to me, I couldn't expect another atheist to then take my word for it that God had revealed himself to me. So when Christians do that, when they say, well, God spoke to me, they have to understand that that's not convincing to me. Personal revelation evidence is only sufficient to the person to whom that evidence was revealed, and that's the only sort of evidence which I would accept. God could manifest himself in my mind, or he could just suddenly make me aware that he's there, but other than that, no evidence is sufficient.
Third, do you think the new atheist movement is ultimately a good thing or a bad thing for free thinkers and skeptics? I define the new atheist movement to be something like the following. the new trend of removing respect from religion in conversations, you know, the sort of attitude that one finds in a Richard Dawkins or a Christopher Hitchens, where anti-theism starts to pop its head up a bit more.
Uncivil discourse is never the preferred route. However, it's a necessary reaction to the kind of attitude we have endured from theism. Just for a couple of examples, we have the Dark Ages, the witch trials, intelligent design advocated in schools, Prop 8. It's always been the case that we are expected to respect other people's beliefs, but they aren't expected to respect ours. So what we've finally come to is this point in history where there are enough of us that we are able to muster our balls and come face to face with the theist and say, look, you're wrong, here's why. And what you're saying, your counter arguments are bullshit. They don't stand up to logic, they don't stand up to scrutiny. Don't use that in a secular society to try to impose rules and regulations on us.
Fourth, what sorts of decisions are affected by your atheism? Are there decisions that you make in your life, aside from the obvious denial of theism, that are a direct result of your views on the non-existence or lack of evidence for God?
No. But there are decisions which might be affected by theism. If I was a theist, I might have a different attitude toward abortion or gay marriage or other things. I might be more accepting of blue laws. Today, I went to Walmart and tried to buy a bottle of Bailey's, and I couldn't because it's Sunday. So, you know, these kind of things tend to frustrate me. They're not decisions. If I was in charge of the government, if I was a senator or a congressman, a state representative, there would be no blue laws. There would be no banishing of gay marriage. There would be no restrictions on abortion because I wouldn't be affected by theism. That doesn't mean that my atheism is what's affecting these decisions. The atheism is not in itself something which has standards. What I'm doing is I'm eliminating this factor where I believe that there's a God who's overlooking things that I do and judging me for them, removing that from my decision making, and then I'm free to make decisions based on just how I think things should be and what's right and what's wrong and what's logical. That liberation doesn't mean that I'm affected by the atheism. It means that I'm unaffected by the theism.
And lastly, my fifth and final question, what's more important, acquiring as many true beliefs as possible or not acquiring as many false beliefs as possible?
We can never know if we've acquired a true belief. Any belief that we have is going to be dependent on the world that we live in and how it affects our day-to-day life, and are we confronted with evidence to the contrary. If we're not confronted with evidence to the contrary, any belief that we have is basically going to be a valid belief for us. But false beliefs, having false beliefs can have actual detrimental effects. So avoiding clearly false beliefs is probably more important than acquiring true beliefs, because it's really not possible to know that you have a true belief, but you can know that you have a false belief, and it is essential to avoid those.
And again, my goal, at least in this video, is not to argue, but rather to listen.
I appreciate that, and I hope that some of this was of value to you, and maybe I'll answer another one sometime. Thank you.